Good morning, painters. Deb Watson here to paint fall leaves. First, we'll save the barn edges with masking tape. Tear off a piece of tape longer than the barn. Then hold a razor blade firmly along the edge and just tear off the excess tape. This is an easy way to keep perfectly straight edges when you paint buildings. But test this on scrap paper to be sure that the paper doesn't tear when you remove the tape. Start with a little hint of sky, wet on wet. You can use any blue, but keep it very light. The trees can be any fall colors you like, but keep in mind that 2 trees are light in value and the background trees are dark. Start on dry paper with yellow, the lightest color. Use a big brush and skip places. Just lay some color on all the trees. For the tree on the left, use a big brush with burnt sienna and red, letting some of the yellow show through. Now you still want this color to dry to be a light value, so don't use too much paint. When you get to the bottom, you want the edges of that little shrub to be ragged and leafy looking, not straight. The middle tree gets just some burnt sienna. It's growing a lot into my sky, so I tilt my board and let gravity help keep the wet paint from spreading too much. Next, give the distant hills a light color just along the top, and then spread the color down with a wet brush so that the bottom is even lighter. For the area behind the 2 main trees, mix a more concentrated, darker color. I'm using burnt sienna with a little blue to make it darker. Test your paper to see if it's wet. Mine is still too wet to work on, but it's the perfect time to add texture to the trees we painted. One technique to add texture is to spatter wet paint with clean water. Load a small brush with clean water and tap it on your finger to fling water drops onto the drying wash. See the tiny blooms forming? A second technique to add texture is to sprinkle the drying wash with table salt. You can use regular salt or large crystal salt. Table salt creates small splotches, and the larger salt will create larger splotches. Now that my paper is dry, I can paint the background trees with the darker color. When you're painting behind a tree, you want to create leafy-looking edges. You can use a small brush or a piece of natural sponge. For sponging, use a tiny piece of sponge that's just damp. Load it with paint and touch the edges of the sponge to the paper to create those leafy edges. The background trees continue on the other side. I want to keep the bottom edge straight, but instead of masking tape, you can also use a credit card or a piece of watercolor paper with a straight edge. That helps keep the paint from going on the foreground. The mixes of color that I'm using are listed in the instructions. This area would look best if it was darker near the bottom. To make a darker color, you can mix dark blue with your burnt sienna or use a black. You can also use that darker bit to suggest a thin dead tree, and be sure you stick it out over the top. The first layer has texture, but you need to add another layer to make the trees look more believable. The tree on the right is going to get more color sponged on. I'm going to start with the light color and once again get darker as I go towards the bottom. Next, paint the two light shrubs at the bottom, using plenty of yellow and a hint of blue or green. You can use the same techniques to add texture to the shrubs. Those are spattering, sponging, and salt. And once again, they'll look better if they're a little darker at the bottom. Spattering is fun once you get the hang of it. The more you spatter, the more realistic many of your trees will look. Then dry well. To make a gray for the barn, start with a dark gray or black. I made gray by mixing dark blue and brown. Paint a line of black under the top edge of the roof and use a clean wet brush to pull some color down into the gray barn. The roof of this barn only needs a hint of color. You can use the same gray or add a little bit more brown. I paint a light color on and then lift most of it back off with a thirsty brush. For the red barn, you can make a barn red by mixing your red with some of your gray. To add texture for the boards, you can take a damp brush with clean water and make vertical strokes in the wet red wash. Add darker red or black around the edges, and while that dries, you can give the gray barn another coat of paint if it needs more color. The bottom of the red barn is red on the left and black on the right, which is an open door. You can indicate the shingles on the roof with black lines across the top, and the inside of the window is black also. The foreground is yellow or very light at the top, going to green at the bottom. It's easier to get a nice blend of colors if you use a bigger brush. Last, it's time for the finishing touches. Darken the area above the shrub and add a few darker areas in the middle. You can add limbs to any of the trees you like. I would keep the ones farther away, smaller and thinner, like adding limbs to the middle light-colored tree, and add a thicker tree trunk to the tree on the right because it's closer to us. The tree trunk is going to peek through the darker areas you just sponged on. Now you can evaluate your values and your buildings. If something looks washed out, you can always add another coat of paint. And a small fence in the background always looks nice. Last, I'm using some opaque white to clean up my roof edges and add a white tree on the left. And that's a free tutorial on all the techniques to add texture for realistic looking fall trees. I hope you liked it. Check out some of my other tutorials on fall landscapes or visit my website for everything watercolor. Happy painting!